October 25th, 1957, 10:15 in the morning. The Barber shop, inside the Park Sheraton Hotel, 7th Avenue and 55th Street, Manhattan. Albert Anastasia sat in chair number 4, a hot towel draped across his face, his eyes closed. He was getting a shave. He'd left his bodyguard parked in the garage. His pistol was in his overcoat, hanging on a hook across the room. 2 men walked in through the 55th Street entrance, scarves pulled up over their mouths, fedoras pulled low. They didn't say a word. They walked straight to chair number 4. They opened fire. The first shot shattered the mirror behind him. Anastasia lunged forward, saw only reflections, and charged at the glass thinking his killers were in front of him. That's how they found him, face down on the tile floor, lather still on his cheek. 5 bullets in his back and head. The shave, half finished. The hit took under 15 seconds. This wasn't just another mob murder. Albert Anastasia was the Lord High Executioner, the boss of what the newspapers called Murder Incorporated. The man who, by federal estimates, had ordered or personally committed somewhere between 200 and 1,000 killings across 3 decades. He ran the waterfront. He ran one of the 5 New York families. He scared Lucky Luciano. He scared Frank Costello. He scared everyone. And he was killed in broad daylight, in a public hotel, surrounded by witnesses, and not one person in that barber shop could ever identify the shooters. This is the story of how the most feared killer in American organized crime got set up by his own people, how a Midtown barber chair became the staging ground for a Mafia coup, how a man named Vito Genovese used Anastasia's own ambition as the knife that killed him, and how that one morning, that one shave, rewired the entire structure of organized crime in America. But here's what the history books barely mention. The hit on Anastasia wasn't just about power. It was about a conversation Anastasia had with a Cuban dictator, $1 billion in casino money, and a betrayal so perfectly engineered that 68 years later, the FBI still can't officially name the shooters. To understand how Albert Anastasia ended up face down on a barber shop floor, you have to go back to a small town in Calabria, Italy. He was born Umberto Anastasio in 1902 in the coastal village of Tropea, son of a railroad worker, one of 12 children. His family had nothing. At 15, he worked as a deckhand on a freighter bound for New York. At 17, he jumped ship in Brooklyn and never went back. He changed the name from Anastasio to Anastasia, he said, so his mother would never read about him in the newspapers. It didn't work. She read about him plenty. By 1921, Umberto was working the Brooklyn docks. The waterfront in those years was the bloodiest real estate in America. Longshoremen fought each other for shape-up jobs at dawn. Italian gangs fought Irish gangs for control of the piers. Umberto was 19 years old, built like a middleweight boxer, with dead black eyes and no fear of anything. In March of that year, he got into a dispute with another longshoreman named Joe Torino. They argued over a work assignment. Anastasia strangled him with his bare hands on Pier 18. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. He sat in Sing Sing's death row for 18 months, waiting for the electric chair. Then something strange happened. The conviction was overturned on appeal. A new trial was ordered. 4 key witnesses suddenly couldn't remember what they'd seen. One disappeared entirely. Another was found dead in a gutter in Red Hook. The charges were dropped. Anastasia walked out of prison in 1922, a free man and a legend on the docks. That was the moment the Mafia noticed him. Giuseppe Masseria, the boss of bosses at the time, brought him in. So did a young hustler from the Lower East Side named Charles Luciano. Luciano would later call Anastasia the most dangerous man he ever worked with. And Luciano worked with a lot of dangerous men. Through the 1920s and early 30s, Anastasia rose fast. He sided with Luciano in the Castellammaris War. He was one of the 4 gunmen who walked into Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant on Coney Island on April 15, 1931. And put bullets into Giuseppe Masseria, while Luciano conveniently excused himself to the bathroom. 6 months later, on September 10th, 1931, Anastasia helped coordinate the citywide massacre that killed Salvatore Maranzano and more than 40 old guard bosses across America. It was called the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, though historians now dispute how many actually died that day. What is not disputed is this: when the smoke cleared, Lucky Luciano was the new king, and Albert Anastasia was his favorite executioner. Luciano and Meyer Lansky then did something no one had done before. They organized. They created the commission. 5 New York families, Chicago, and the other major cities, all with seats at a ruling table, and they created a separate enforcement arm. A group of killers for hire who would carry out sanctioned hits across the country. No freelancing, no emotion, just business. They called it the combination. The newspapers called it Murder Incorporated. The man they put in charge of it was Albert Anastasia. He was 29 years old. For the next decade, Anastasia ran the most efficient killing machine in American history. Based out of Midnight Rose's candy store at the corner of Saratoga and Livonia in Brownsville, Brooklyn, Murder Incorporated operated with a simple structure. Here's how it worked. A boss somewhere in the country had a problem. A witness, a rival, a business partner who talked too much. He'd make a phone call to the commission. The commission would vote. If approved, the contract went to Louis Buchalter or directly to Anastasia. Anastasia would pick a team, usually 2 to 4 shooters. Men like Abe Reles, Harry Strauss, Frank Abendondo. They'd travel to the target city. They'd do the job. They'd come home. The local police had no leads because the killers had no local connections, no motive, no prints, no witnesses who'd talk. The crew got paid between $1,000 and $5,000 per hit, depending on the difficulty. Anastasia got a percentage of every contract, plus his cut from the commission. By 1940, federal investigators estimated Murder Incorporated had killed between 400 and 1,000 people nationwide. Not a single member had ever been convicted. Then came Abe Reles. Reles, known as Kid Twist, was one of Anastasia's top shooters. In February of 1940, Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer arrested him on a murder charge. Facing the electric chair, Reles did the unthinkable. He flipped. He sat in an interrogation room for 12 straight days and laid out everything: names, dates, methods, locations. He confessed to participating in 11 murders himself and provided evidence on dozens more. His testimony sent Louis Buchalter to the electric chair in 1944. It was supposed to send Albert Anastasia there next. On the morning of November 12, 1941, Reles was being held under 24-hour police protection at the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. 6 detectives were assigned to guard his room. At 7 a.m., his body was found on the hotel extension roof, 5 stories below his window. Bed sheets were tied together to look like an escape rope. The official finding was accidental death during an escape attempt. Nobody believed it. The newspapers started calling Reles the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. Later investigations suggested that Frank Costello had paid $100,000 in bribes to the detectives on duty. With Reles dead, the case against Anastasia collapsed. He was untouchable again. But the damage was done. Anastasia had come too close to the chair. He started changing. He became paranoid, volatile. He killed without commission approval. In 1952, a young Brooklyn clothing salesman named Arnold Schuster appeared on television. Schuster had spotted fugitive bank robber Willie Sutton on a subway and tipped off police. He was a civilian, a hero, a nobody. Anastasia saw the interview, turned to his crew, and said, "I can't stand squealers. Hit that guy." 3 weeks later, on March 8, 1952, Schuster was shot dead on a Brooklyn street corner. The killer, Frederick Tenuto, was himself murdered shortly after to eliminate the trail. That hit broke every rule. Schuster wasn't a mobster. He wasn't a threat. He was a random citizen. The commission was furious. Vito Genovese, Anastasia's longtime rival, started whispering. This man is out of control. He's going to bring the feds down on all of us. Here's where it gets interesting. By 1951, Anastasia had become the official boss of what is now called the Gambino family, after engineering the murder of the previous boss, Vincent Mangano. Mangano simply vanished on April 19, 1951. His body was never found. Anastasia took over. His underboss was a quiet, calculating man named Carlo Gambino. Gambino was the opposite of Anastasia. Small, soft-spoken, humble-looking, always deferential. Anastasia thought he was harmless. That was the mistake that got him killed. Through the mid-50s, Anastasia's ambition grew beyond anything the Commission could tolerate. He wanted casinos. Specifically, he wanted a piece of the Havana operation that Meyer Lansky had built in Cuba. Lansky had spent years cultivating Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. He'd invested millions in the Hotel Nacional, the Riviera, the Capri. Anastasia flew to Havana in the spring of 1957. He met with Batista directly. He tried to cut his own deal. He wanted in. This was a declaration of war. Cuba was Lansky's territory. Lansky was Genovese's closest ally, and Genovese was already building a case to take Anastasia down. There was more. Anastasia had also started selling maid memberships, actual Mafia buttons, for cash, $50,000 per initiation by some accounts. That was sacrilege. Being made was supposed to be earned through bloodshed and loyalty, not purchased. Every boss in America heard about it. Every boss in America was offended. Vito Genovese saw his opening. Genovese was 60 years old in 1957. He'd come back from exile in Italy in 1945. He'd spent 12 years rebuilding his power base. He was underboss of the Luciano family, now technically controlled from exile by Lucky Luciano through acting boss Frank Costello. Genovese wanted the whole thing. Costello's crown, Anastasia's territory, everything. He began making quiet offers to Carlo Gambino, to Joe Profassi, to Tommy Lucchese. If Anastasia goes, you take his operation. If Costello goes, I take mine. We redraw the map. Carlo Gambino listened and agreed. On May 2nd, 1957, the plot's first phase executed. Frank Costello was walking into his apartment building at 1 Central Park West. A massive gunman stepped out of the shadows and yelled, "Hey, Frank, this is for you!" He fired one shot. Costello turned his head at the exact moment of the pull. The bullet grazed his scalp instead of entering his skull. He lived. The shooter, identified later as Vincent Chin Gigante, fled. Costello, shaken, retired from day-to-day operations. That left Anastasia without his main commission ally. Anastasia was now alone. He just didn't know it yet. For the next 5 months, Anastasia kept operating as if nothing had changed. He still held court at his estate at 75 Bluff Road in Fort Lee, New Jersey. He still commuted into Manhattan. He still kept the same routine. Every Friday, he went to the same barber shop at the Park Sheraton Hotel, Arthur Grasso's Grasso Barber Shop, for a shave and trim. His bodyguard, a man named Anthony Coppola, would drop him off and wait in the hotel parking garage. Nobody thought twice about it. The Park Sheraton was a public hotel. There were witnesses everywhere. It was safe. Then came October 25th. That morning, Anastasia left his Fort Lee mansion around 9:30. Coppola drove him across the George Washington Bridge, down the West Side Highway, and over to 7th Avenue. They pulled into the Park Sheraton garage at 10:05. Anastasia got out. Coppola, suspiciously, decided to go for a walk instead of waiting inside the shop. Nobody has ever fully explained why. At 10:10, Anastasia entered the barber shop. He greeted Arthur Grasso, the owner, sat in chair 4, took off his suit jacket, let barber Joseph Bocchino begin the shave. A hot towel went over his face. At 10:15, 2 men entered through the 55th Street door. They wore scarves, dark suits, fedoras. They drew pistols, 45 caliber and 38 caliber, according to ballistics. They fired 10 rounds. The first shots hit Anastasia in the left hand and wrist as he raised his arms instinctively. He tried to stand. He charged forward toward the mirrors. He collapsed. The killers walked out calmly. They dropped their guns in the hallway. They disappeared into the Manhattan lunchtime crowd. The entire shop stood frozen. Not one of the 5 other barbers, the 4 customers, or the 2 shoeshine boys moved for a full minute. When police arrived, they found Anastasia face down in a pool of blood, lather on half his face. His wristwatch had stopped at 10:20. The 5 bullet holes formed a tight cluster. Professional shooting. By nightfall, the NYPD had 100 detectives working the case. Within days, they had a theory. They would never have a conviction. The shooters have been rumored for decades to have been Joseph Profaci gunmen, specifically the brothers Larry and Joseph Gallo, the same Joey Gallo who would later be murdered himself at Umberto's clam house. Gallo allegedly boasted in later years, "From now on, you can call the 5 of us the barbershop quintet." He never said it on the record. He never admitted it in court. Nobody ever will. Some accounts name Stephen Armon and Arnold Wittenberg. The accounts vary. What is documented is this. The hit was sanctioned by Carlo Gambino, approved by Vito Genovese, and contracted to outside shooters so that no finger could be pointed at the Gambino family directly. It was perfect organizational murder. 2 weeks later, on November 14th, 1957, Vito Genovese called the most famous meeting in Mafia history. He summoned 60 of America's top bosses to a farmhouse outside the small town of Appalachian, New York, owned by Buffalo capo Joseph Barber. The agenda was simple. Genovese wanted to be formally named Boss of Bosses. He wanted to ratify the new order. Gambino as Anastasia's successor, Genovese at the top, Lansky in Cuba, everyone in their place. It became a disaster. New York State Trooper Edgar Croswell noticed dozens of expensive cars arriving at the remote farmhouse. He set up a roadblock. When the bosses saw the police, they panicked. 60 men in silk suits ran through the woods. Some were caught in cornfields, some hid in barns. 58 were detained and identified. For the first time in American history, the federal government had documented proof that the Mafia existed as a coordinated national organization. J. Edgar Hoover, who for years had denied the existence of organized crime, could deny it no longer. Appalachian triggered the birth of modern federal Mafia investigations. It gave the FBI its organized crime division. It led eventually to the RICO statutes of 1970. The irony cuts deep. Vito Genovese had killed Anastasia to take control. Within 18 months, Genovese himself was set up by Lansky, Luciano, and Costello in a narcotics sting. He was convicted on April 17, 1959, and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He died behind bars in 1969, never having enjoyed the throne he killed for. Carlo Gambino, however, played the long game perfectly. He took over the Anastasia family. He renamed it the Gambino family. He ran it for 19 years with quiet, ruthless efficiency. He made peace with every other boss. He built the most powerful crime family in American history. He died peacefully of natural causes at his Long Island home on October 15, 1976. His empire passed to his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, who himself would be murdered outside Sparks Steakhouse, 210 East 46th Street, on December 16, 1985, by a rising captain named John Gotti. The cycle repeated. Anthony Coppola, Anastasia's bodyguard, who conveniently took a walk that morning, was questioned for weeks. He never cracked. He never admitted being paid off. He never named anyone. He disappeared from the public record by 1960. Arthur Grasso, the barbershop owner, testified he saw nothing. Joseph Bocchino, the man holding the razor, testified he saw nothing. None of the shooters were ever indicted. The case remains officially open. Here's what the Anastasia hit really changed. Before October 25, 1957, the Mafia was a brotherhood of controlled violence. Hits required commission approval. Civilians were off limits. Bosses negotiated before they killed. After that morning, the rules were different. Bosses could be eliminated by their own underbosses through commission vote. Ambition had limits. Paranoia became currency. Every boss who followed Anastasia understood the lesson. The chair you sit in, the routine you keep, the people you trust, these are the things that kill you. Albert Anastasia spent 40 years building a reputation as the most feared killer in America. He survived 2 death row sentences. He survived a burlesque. He survived federal prosecutors and rival families and his own worst instincts. He commanded an army of murderers. He made millions from the waterfront. He sat on the commission. He had everything a man in that life could want. And he died in a borrowed chair with soap on his face for the price of a $5 shave. He never saw his killers' faces. He never got to fire back. He never even got off the floor. That's the real story of the Mafia. Not the power, not the glory, not the myth. The truth is simpler and colder. In that life, the people closest to you are the ones holding the knife. Your underboss votes. Your barber shop becomes your execution chamber. Your bodyguard takes a walk. And the world goes on without you by lunchtime. If this story pulled you in, hit that subscribe button. We drop a new Mafia Talks documentary every single week. Drop a comment below. Who do you think actually pulled the triggers in Grasso's barber shop that morning? The Gallo brothers? The Professi crew? Somebody else? Let us know what you think. And remember, in this world, the shave always ends the same way.